When an airplane was flying at high altitude, there was the sound of animals moving from the cargo hold. The female flight attendant carefully opened the cargo hold door to check but did not find any animals. As soon as she closed the cargo hold door, a loud banging sound suddenly came from below. Then the screws on the cargo hold door also shook out one by one. A moment later, the plane landed safely at the airport. But when the ground staff came to check, he found that there was no light in the plane, and the engine was as cold as a corpse. It was as if it had never taken off. Bishop immediately realized the seriousness of the problem, so he immediately asked his subordinates to notify all relevant departments because there might be no survivors on this plane. Soon, the police and relevant departments arrived at the scene. Ephraim was a professor at the Center for Disease Control. He was informed by the staff that there were a total of 200 passengers on the plane. They used life-detecting equipment to scan the plane but found no signs of life inside. Ephraim thought that there might be some kind of virus on the plane, so he and his assistant Nora Martinez went in. As soon as they entered, the scene before them immediately shocked them both. All 210 passengers had died while still in their seats. There were no bruises on their faces and no signs of struggle on their bodies, but their skin was very dry and had lost its elasticity. This condition did not resemble some kind of virus infection, but rather something that had sucked the life out of them in an instant. Ephraim discovered a large amount of mucus under the UV light. These fluids almost covered the entire cabin. Immediately after that, the two decided to separate to check. They didn't notice a passenger's hand suddenly move. Ephraim went to the cargo hold to check inside, and there was mucus everywhere, but he didn't find anything suspicious. At this time, Nora went to the cockpit. The two pilots were also sitting in their seats and had stopped breathing like the other passengers. Just as Nora wanted to take a closer look at Pilot's death, the other pilot suddenly woke up. Ephraim heard a strange sound and rushed over, but on the way he bumped into a survivor who was calling for help. There were also two other passengers who had also woken up. Jim was outside and intended to call the special forces in, but was stopped by Ephraim. He asked Jim to call the medical staff inside. The four survivors were found and temporarily isolated. Although there were no signs of abnormalities on their bodies, they didn't remember what happened at that time and only felt like they had just slept. At this moment, the staff found a strange object in the cabin of the plane. From the outside, it looked like a coffin. There were ancient patterns carved on it. Ephraim asked his assistant to open the coffin, but it was filled with a bucket of clay, and there was a latch on the door that could be opened from the inside. The question was, how could such a large object be brought onto the plane, and why would a plane be used to transport a pile of clay? All of this was too strange. Ephraim immediately asked his assistant to take a sample of the soil for testing and told Bishop not to let anyone near. In another development, an old man with a heavy face entered the basement after watching the news about the plane crash on TV. He held a long sword with a silver handle and then sat down in front of a heart that was soaked in solution. He said that thing had returned. He didn't know if he still had the strength, but this time he absolutely could not fail. The old man seemed to know the cause of the plane crash, and the heart in the jar was his wife's heart. Every day he used his blood to feed the worms inside. While Bishop was on the phone investigating the origin of the coffin, a sudden shrill scream rang out in his ears. Bishop immediately followed the sound into a warehouse. There he saw a black thing lying on the ground. As soon as he bent down to observe carefully, the monster suddenly rose up and restrained him. The monster immediately sucked all the blood from Bishop's body, then stretched out its tentacles and disappeared deep into the warehouse. In another development, the forensic staff discovered strange points on the bodies of the passengers. All the victims had a precise cut on their necks, and in their bodies, there was only protein without any blood cells. All of this was completely beyond their understanding. Ephraim thought that it might be caused by some creature, so he and Nora prepared to go into the cargo hold to check it out. However, on the way, they met an old man. The old man told Ephraim that he had seen this virus before and had even fought it. If they wanted to completely stop the outbreak of the virus, they had to kill everyone on the plane. Ephraim heard the old man's crazy behavior and didn't pay any attention to it. Ephraim handed the old man over to his assistant and was about to leave, but the old man suddenly called them back loudly and told them all the characteristics of the bodies of the deceased. Nora looked at the old man with a surprised expression because they had never released this information to the public, yet he knew all this. However, the old man's next words surprised everyone even more. He asked Ephraim about the coffin and said that if they had the coffin in hand, they could still control the virus. As long as they destroyed the coffin and didn't let it cross the river, everything would still be under human control. Meanwhile, a man in a suit came to see a local Gus in an alley in Manhattan. The man asked Gus to deliver an item to the airport, but the entire airport was currently locked down, so Gus didn't want to risk entering the airport. The man in the suit took out a black black card from his pocket and told Gus that as long as he had this card, he could enter and exit the airport as he pleased. As long as you completed the mission, I would help clear your brother's criminal record and your mother's long-term residency permit here. For the sake of his family, Gus finally agreed. At this time, Ephraim and Nora had arrived at the cargo hold. After a thorough search, Ephraim discovered a filaria worm in the gap of the plane's cabin. This filaria worm looked extremely ferocious. Ephraim thought that this might be the cause of death for the 206 passengers. Immediately after, Nora also discovered a pile of mud and dirt filled with filaria worms. The two of them immediately thought of the coffin and rushed to the warehouse, but at this time, the coffin had disappeared, making them immediately feel that something was wrong. They hurriedly went to the surveillance room. Through the video recording, they discovered that the coffin had been carried away by a black shadow at an extremely fast speed. Seeing this scene, Nora remembered what the old man had said, that if they had the coffin in their hands, they could still control the virus. And that was most likely the reason the coffin was stolen. It had only been 7 minutes since the coffin disappeared, so Ephraim guessed that the coffin was definitely still in the airport. He immediately asked Jim to control all the entrances and exits of the airport and thoroughly check the large trucks entering and leaving the airport. However, at this time, Gus had already arrived at the underground parking lot. Gus got into a truck as requested, and in that truck was the coffin that had disappeared. Gus didn't pay attention and drove the truck out, but when he reached the gate, he was stopped. The police dog also barked madly and went to the truck. Gus took out his black card and gave it to the police, but the police took the black card and looked at him with a puzzled expression. Immediately after that, the police asked Gus to get out of the car for inspection. At this moment, Jim stepped forward and took the black card from the police. After Jim looked at it, he told the police that this was the car of the Center for Disease Control, so there was no need to check. After all the police left, Jim seriously told Gus to tell him that I would not work for that person anymore, and this would be the last time I would help them. It turned out that Jim was the insider of the man in the suit and his gang. Then Jim went to find Ephraim alone and reported that he had not found the coffin. Ephraim still did not understand how a coffin weighing several tons could be lifted by that shadow in an instant. This was completely beyond the limits of human strength. At present, the only clue left in their hands were a few filaria worms in the box. The man who discovered a head of a corpse crushed into powder in the warehouse was the bishop who was attacked by the monster. Nora discovered a large amount of mucus at the scene, and this mucus was identical to the mucus on the plane. She thought that this could be the secretions of some creature. At this time, Ephraim received a call from the Center for Disease Control. The superiors wanted to release the 4 survivors on the plane, so Ephraim had to immediately go to the scene to stop them. Ephraim said that the 4 survivors might be carrying some kind of pathogen and that this pathogen had an incubation period, so they needed to be isolated for further monitoring. However, the survivors thought that Ephraim was taking this opportunity to become famous, so they insisted on leaving. Ephraim had no choice but to ask police to force them back. At the same time, in the Stoneheart Group building, the man in the suit came to see billionaire Eldridge Palmer. He said that the 4 survivors had not been released yet, and that if they continued like this, it would slow down their plans. But billionaire Palmer told him that in an hour, no one would continue to talk about this incident, and the survivors would also be released. It turned out that all of this was caused by 2 people. Palmer did it just because of the monster in the coffin. He asked when he could see it. Then he received the answer that it had crossed the river. He would see it soon. That was what they had agreed upon. At this time, the coffin was transported by Gus to the designated location, but he did not see the man in the suit here. Gus was curious and wanted to open it to see what was inside the coffin. But at that moment, the coffin suddenly moved and made creepy sounds, causing Gus to immediately run away in fear. Ephraim was also summoned to the office by his superior. His superior told Ephraim that the plane case had been transferred to the FBI for management. They had to immediately restore the airport and release the 4 survivors who were being quarantined so as not to affect the city's economy. Ephraim still wanted to explain the seriousness of the matter, but his superior's attitude was very firm. His superiors told Ephraim to go home and rest and not to get involved in this case anymore. Ephraim had no choice but to secretly investigate. Ephraim and Nora found the pilot among the survivors. At this time, the pilot's face was very pale. However, he also wanted to investigate this case clearly because after all, there were 206 passengers who had died on his plane. When Ephraim asked pilot about the origin of the coffin on the plane, he said that the coffin was transported by a group of government employees. However, because he had previously transported confidential documents, he did not think much of it. Now the death of the 206 passengers was very likely related to that coffin. After getting the information from the captain, Ephraim introduced introduced him to a doctor and advised him to have a general health check. At the same time, the other two survivors were having dinner together. Their faces were also unusually pale and their eyes were bloodshot. When the woman was drinking, two of her teeth suddenly fell out. She thought it was because of bleeding gums and didn't pay attention. After that, the two said goodbye and returned home. Meanwhile, the long-haired man named Gabriel asked his assistant to find some beautiful girls to relieve stress. But just as they were about to have a passionate night, Gabriel stared at the veins on the girl's neck. A feeling of hunger suddenly took over his mind, and he immediately bit down. The girls ran away in fear, while Gabriel frantically licked the blood on the floor. In another development, billionaire Palmer and a man in a suit named Thomas arrived in front of the coffin. Suddenly a dark shadow flashed behind Palmer, and then Palmer bowed his head and slowly sank to the ground. The famous billionaire now had to respectfully welcome the guest in the coffin to the new world. The guest was also grateful that Palmer did not mind the long distance to bring him here. He asked Palmer if he wanted to see my face. Then he slowly opened the coffin lid. Little Emma died suddenly on the plane, but strangely the next night she came back to life and returned home. Emma's father thought that Ephraim had brought his daughter home, so he immediately called to thank her. But when Ephraim heard that Emma had returned home, he was extremely shocked. Ephraim asked again to confirm that Emma's body had been brought home. But Emma's father said that it was not a corpse, but a living Emma, an Emma with flesh and bones and breathing. However, it was clear that Ephraim had seen Emma die with his own eyes, so it was impossible for her to come back alive. To clarify the matter, Ephraim and Nora went to the morgue. But at this time, there was no staff there, and all the bodies in the body bags had disappeared. The only thing left at the scene was a broken glass. At the same time, Emma came home and was bathing in the bathtub. Her bloodshot eyes showed that she was infected, but the father, who was immersed in joy, did not notice this. Just as he was about to take a towel to give to her, a long tongue suddenly protruded from her mouth. The tip of the tongue stuck tightly to the father's neck, and in just a few seconds, the father fell into the bathtub and died. In another development, after discovering the bodies disappeared, Ephraim immediately reported to his superiors, but now that the case has been taken over by the FBI, his superiors think that the military may have moved the bodies. He advised Ephraim not to continue investigating the case, but the reason why the military left 4 survivors is still a confusing knot here. Afterwards, Ephraim and Nora went to the hospital to visit the surviving pilot, but at this time the pilot's body was very weak and his internal organs were rapidly deteriorating. They had to quickly find the source of the virus because only then could the virus continue to spread. At this time, Nora suddenly remembered the old man who appeared at the airport. She thought that maybe he knew some clues. At that time, the old man had just been released from the police station. Nora hurriedly chased after him, but unexpectedly, the old man knew the reason she came here. He told Nora that all the bodies disappeared because of the monster in the coffin. The monster's purpose was to destroy the world and devour the light. Nora wanted to ask the old man to help them, but he said it was too late. The only way was to find all the passengers and destroy their bodies and those who had come into contact with them. Nora heard this method, and her face showed disbelief. The old man saw that she did not believe him and turned away. In another development, Ephraim went to Emma's house. He wanted to see if the lost girl had really returned, but when he walked around the house, he did not see a single person, and even the girl's father was unknown. Ephraim found some hair in the bathtub upstairs. Just as Ephraim was about to go into the bedroom to check, Nora called the forest as if it was urgent. He hung up and left in a hurry. As soon as he left, the little girl's figure slowly emerged from behind the door. Ephraim quickly arrived at the hospital. Pilot Redfern's condition had begun to deteriorate. A voice kept ringing in Redfern's ears, saying he was here. The pilot's body was also filled with worms that kept wriggling. Ephraim saw this situation and immediately decided to operate on the pilot. But while they were discussing the details outside, the pilot escaped from the isolation room. Everyone immediately split up to search the hospital. Jim found the pilot in the basement. At this time, the pilot was frantically sucking blood from the blood bag. It was clear that he had now turned into a zombie. When he saw Jim, Redfern immediately rushed over, scaring Jim to the point of losing the strength to resist. Just as Redfern was about to suck Jim's blood, fortunately, Nora arrived in time. But this weak girl was absolutely no match for Redfern. Ephraim also ran over soon after. He was shocked to see that Redfern had mutated. After that, they had a hard time knocking Redfern out. Just as the three of them were about to breathe a sigh of relief, Redfern got up again. Ephraim immediately raised the fire extinguisher in his hand and smashed it until Redfern died. Everyone looked at the corpse on the ground with disbelief. They could not believe that Redfern had turned into such a monster. This man named Thomas had lived for 1,000 years. Every day when he went out, he had to disguise himself in all sorts of ways. He skillfully adjusted the fake nose he had installed and then used glue to fix a layer of fake skin. Next, Next were fake ears, fake teeth, and finally a thick wig. After that, he applied a thick layer of foundation all over his body, and a man in a neat suit appeared. He would no longer need to disguise himself any longer. He was the first general who hid under the blood ancestor for 1,000 years, just to plan to invade humanity. Now that the blood ancestor has returned, they have begun to spread the plan that has been planned for thousands of years. The first people to be infected were the 4 survivors on the plane. The man wearing glasses named Anson, after returning home from the airport, began to weaken. There were always ear-piercing roars in his head, and his teeth showed signs of falling out. When he saw the blood flowing from the stake, his body could not control itself and directly drank it. This scared his wife next to him. The man wearing glasses knew that he had transformed, so he told his wife to take the children and leave for the safety of the family. The next morning, the wife returned home worriedly. She did not see Anson in the room, but only saw a lot of dog hair on the pillow. Immediately after that, she found a bloody dog collar in the snow. At this moment, she seemed to realize something. Then she followed the trail of blood on the ground to a warehouse. Sure enough, she saw Anson there. But at this time, Anson had completely transformed. In order not to harm his family, he had chained himself before transforming. A voice in his head screamed at him to tear out his wife's throat. However, his instinct to protect his loved ones kept him conscious before completely transforming. He asked his wife to lock the door and leave. He told her that no matter what he said, she was not allowed to stay and to run as far away as possible. As soon as his wife ran out of the warehouse, Anson's roar attracted the neighbors. The neighbor thought it was their dog barking in the warehouse and decided to rush in to teach it a lesson. The wife hurriedly stopped the neighbor and kept apologizing, but the neighbor's mouth kept pouring out obscene words. He even insulted her children, and these words immediately caused a vicious thought to arise in her mind. She lured the neighbor to the warehouse door, then pushed him inside and slammed the door shut. Accompanied by the miserable screams from inside, the neighbor had to pay a heavy price for his lack of civility. At the same time, another survivor, Gabriel, had also transformed. His eyes were bloodshot and his long, flowing hair had fallen out. Even his penis had become emaciated. Even when he went to the toilet because he used too much force, his penis fell out and was flushed straight down the drain. This was an unprecedented surgery because the person lying in the forest sick was the transformed pilot, Redfern. Ephraim's team performed an autopsy on his body and found that all of his internal organs had died. However, the strange thing was that underneath the dead internal organs, a completely new circulatory system had grown, and these systems were all connected to the fleshy spines that were coming out of the corpse's mouth. Ephraim slowly pulled out the spines, but unexpectedly, they were 40 centimeters long. Based on this, Ephraim assumed that this might be a mutated parasite that parasitized the human body to drain the host and then reproduce. This immediately reminded them of what the old man had said. The thing in the coffin was the source of all this. At this time, an epidemic was spreading throughout the city. Nora was confused and asked Ephraim what they should do now. Ephraim could only shake his head helplessly. Now all he could think of was to go out and stop the situation from getting worse. Even if no one helped, they had to find a way. After realizing the seriousness of the situation, Jim finally confessed to Ephraim that he had let the coffin left the airport. Jim thought that it was just some ordinary soil inside, and he did it all for his wife. Now his wife was in the final stages of cancer, so he could only cooperate with those people so that his wife could be treated. Nora asked Jim who was the mastermind behind it, but Jim said that he had never met that person and that they had always been in contact by phone. Ephraim angrily punched Jim. After that, Jim decided to cut ties with Jim and no longer have anything to do with him. Now the situation was urgent, so they had to quickly find the remaining survivors and the missing bodies. Nora told Ephraim that the old man had told her that the bodies would return to their loved ones. Ephraim immediately remembered that Emma had returned home, so they both rushed to her house. But the house was still empty and her father was nowhere to be seen. Ephraim and Nora cautiously went to a cellar. There they saw Emma's figure, but now she had transformed. Ephraim did not know. He was about to go forward to check when the girl immediately attacked them. The 40-centimeter long tongue in her mouth continuously attacked them, leaving them completely defenseless. But at this moment, the old man Abraham suddenly appeared and finished her off with just one slash of his sword. Nora was so scared that she almost fell to the ground. Before they could calm down, the transformed father suddenly appeared right in front of them. Abraham hurriedly went forward, cut off his tongue. Abraham recited a spell and then decisively killed him. Ephraim hurriedly checked to see if Nora was okay. Abraham then told them to stay away and not let the worms touch them. Nora was in a panic. She grabbed the old man and asked him what he had done, but the old man said he had just saved her life. However, Nora did not agree with the old man's solution. However, the old man said that this was the only way. After hearing this, Nora quickly turned around and left because she still could not accept his actions. She thought that those people were just sick, so they could not be killed just like that. Ephraim wanted to advise Nora to accept the reality that those people were actually no longer breathing and their bodies were being controlled by other creatures. He said that if they did not destroy them, they would infect many more people. But Nora persisted in her thinking. She believed that there must be another way. Then, she left alone. Ephraim chose to follow Abraham, and they would kill all the survivors. Abraham told Ephraim that he had seen the blood ancestors decades ago. At that time, the German army sent Abraham to a farm, and the officer in charge of the farm was Thomas. One night, while everyone was sleeping, a shadow suddenly broke into their dormitory. The shadow found a janitor in the dormitory and directly sucked his blood. Abraham witnessed the whole scene with his own eyes. But the next morning, the people in the army said that the janitor had died of illness. Abraham told his friends that last night he had seen a monster sucking the man's blood with his own eyes, but they did not believe him and thought that he might have had a nightmare. However, that same night, the monster came to the dormitory again. But this time, Abraham's friend was unlucky enough to be chosen by the monster. Abraham watched with his own eyes as his friend was sucked by the monster, while he lay on the bed without daring to make a sound. Now that the monster had appeared again, Abraham had also created weapons to deal with him. Abraham gave Ephraim a homemade gun. The silver spikes that shot out from it could weaken the power of the transformed ones. Then, the two went to the house of one of the survivors, Anson. As soon as they entered the house, they saw that the survivor's wife had died. Abraham used a silver mirror to look into the woman's eyes and found that she was not infected with the virus. So the two continued to search for the survivor in the house. Suddenly, a growl came from the warehouse outside. Abraham knew that this was the cry of that monster. The two immediately cautiously headed towards the warehouse. Abraham pulled out his sword, and Ephraim also raised his phone and gun. He wanted to record all of this. After preparing, the two entered the warehouse, and sure enough, they saw Anson, but he had already turned into a monster. Ephraim shot the silver nails in the gun into the monster's body. Then Abraham directly slashed his sword and cut off its head. Even the neighbor who was hiding in the corner and had not yet transformed was conveniently killed by Abraham. Immediately after that, Abraham poured gasoline around and set the entire warehouse on fire. After all, Ephraim also believed that they were facing a demon. Ephraim wanted Abraham to go with him to find his superiors, because with this video they could request a thorough investigation, but Abraham knew that it was hard for people to believe. Abraham knew that this was hopeless, but he had seen people standing by in fear. Abraham believed that human indifference was the greatest evil. They had work to do, so there was no need to waste their time. At this time, another survivor, Gabriel, had also transformed. Gabriel's assistant thought he was sick, so she found a doctor, but not long after, the assistant suddenly heard the doctor's miserable screams from upstairs. When she went upstairs, she saw Gabriel sucking the doctor's blood. She was scared and ran away, but she still called a professional cleaner so as not to damage Gabriel's reputation. Not long after, a man named Vasily arrived at the scene and skillfully cleaned up the bloodstains on the floor. However, at this moment, Gabriel suddenly attacked Vasily, but he immediately threw Gabriel away. Next, Vasily pulled out a pistol and shot Gabriel. But the strange thing was that the blood flowing from Gabriel's body was white. While Vasily was observing carefully, in another development, Ephraim was rushing to see his superior. Ephraim brought out the video he had just recorded. The superior's expression was extremely serious after watching the video. Then he said he would call immediately to inform. But after the superior left, Jim secretly told Ephraim that they had a video of him dragging the captain's body into the basement. And at this time, the FBI was hunting Ephraim on a large scale. Only then did Ephraim realize, and he immediately wanted to leave. But his access card was disabled. Jim used his authority to open the door. With Jim's help, Ephraim escaped the building safely. Thomas was the first general under the vampires. In order to drink fresh blood every day, he kept a man locked in his room. Thomas slowly turned the iron chain on the floor, and the struggling man restrained on the stone slab gradually appeared. No matter how the man begged, Thomas still stretched out his long tongue. Not long after, the man's face darkened. In another development, Abraham also went to the house of one of the survivors named Brubber. As soon as he entered the door, Abraham saw unfinished food on the table. It was clear that this family might have met with an accident. Abraham took the silver sword and went down to the basement. Blood splattered everywhere on the walls. Abraham carefully searched inside. Abraham saw several transformed monsters eating in the corner. Abraham pulled out his homemade gun and was about to shoot when another huge monster came out from the side. Abraham quickly turned the gun barrel to attack. The silver nails in the gun hit the monster and immediately slowed it down. Immediately after that, Abraham raised the silver sword in his hand and slashed off the monster's head. But the noise of the battle also attracted other monsters. The worst thing was that Abraham's heart disease suddenly relapsed at this moment. Abraham hurriedly took the medicine bottle from his chest, but accidentally accidentally dropped the bottle on the ground. At this time, the monster was close, so he could only hold back the pain and fight while retreating. Thanks to the silver nail gun in his hand, he finally escaped the basement safely. The monsters below did not dare to go out because of the sunlight. As soon as Abraham went out, he immediately slammed the door shut and sat down on the ground, panting. A moment later, Abraham went to the living room and put a candle on the stove, then turned on all the gas valves. As long as the gas reaches a certain level, an explosion will occur here and the infected will be destroyed. At the same time, infected people also appeared at a nursing home, and Nora happened to be there to visit her mother. After seeing those long-tongued monsters, she quickly pulled her mother away from there. Ephraim also went to his ex-wife Kelly's house and told her to take the child and leave immediately because the whole city was now experiencing a terrible epidemic. However, his ex-wife was very confused after she heard what he said because she thought he was obsessed with child custody. However, just as Ephraim was trying to explain, the FBI people arrived. It turned out that just now, Ephraim's ex-wife's boyfriend had called the police after he saw Ephraim. Since the captain had died, Ephraim was now the biggest suspect. When he was taken away, Ephraim still warned his ex-wife to leave quickly. Immediately after that, Ephraim was taken into the interrogation room. They showed them a photo of Ephraim committing the crime and asked why he killed the captain. But at this time, Ephraim was completely in no mood to answer his questions. He just wanted to inform his ex-wife to take the child and leave immediately. The man saw that Ephraim was not cooperating, so he slapped Ephraim straight in the face, and this slap also calmed Ephraim down. Ephraim told them about the epidemic spreading and allowed them to go to the survivors' homes to investigate, but the two FBI men did not believe him. They thought Ephraim was joking and led them to court and intended to take Ephraim to court. Ephraim reluctantly confessed and said he could take them to find the captain's body. The once-in-a-millennium eclipse had arrived. Horrifying vampires were roaming the streets, and all of this was the beginning of the vampire invasion of humanity. Ephraim and the FBI agents were stuck on the highway, and suddenly a changeling appeared next to them. Ephraim quickly told them that it was the one who disappeared with the body, but two thought he was just a madman. The changeling opened the car door and rushed at the driver. The two agents saw this and immediately tried to stop him. Ephraim tried to persuade the two not to get out of the car, but they still got out and ran out. An agent rushed to ask the changeling to stop, but he was killed by the changeling's long tongue. After the two agents were killed, the changeling rushed into the crowd nearby. Ephraim saw this and quickly got out of the car and went to the agent's side. At this time, the agent was only breathing his last breath. Ephraim used his key to open the handcuffs and softly scolded, "I clearly warned you, but you didn't listen, so bye-bye." Then Ephraim immediately found Abraham. Now there were mutants everywhere outside, so they had to join forces. Abraham took Ephraim to a basement, but unexpectedly, Nora and her mother were also there. It turned out that when Nora saw the long-tongued monster, she brought her mother here. Immediately after that, Abraham told the two that according to his countless self-tests, only silver could harm those monsters, so they had to quickly find the vampires to stop everything. However, Ephraim thought that relying on their own strength alone would not be able to fight those monsters. Only then did Abraham say that killing the vampires was enough, because after the vampires were finished, the infected would also fall. Now the top priority was to find the vampires' hideout. Nora immediately thought of Jim, because Jim had worked with those people before, so maybe they could find the vampires' lair through him. At this time, Jim was preparing to take his wife away from here, because he also knew that this city was about to collapse. While Jim was explaining to his wife, there was a knock on the door, and the people who came were Ephraim's group. They told Jim's wife the cause of the incident. Jim also knew that all of this was his fault, so he decided to let his wife leave here alone. Jim decided to stay and help Ephraim's group find the vampire. Based on Jim's description, Abraham knew that the person who worked with Jim was Thomas. Thomas was the first general under the vampire command. Jim then made an appointment to meet Thomas. Meanwhile, Ephraim's group was lying in wait for an opportunity, but Thomas, upon arriving, immediately guessed their plan. Thomas said that he had smelled Abraham's scent. Thomas asked where Abraham was hiding. Jim was about to deny what Thomas said, but Thomas grabbed him by the collar and threatened him by draining his blood and turning Jim into a demon. Although Jim's body was shaking violently, he still tried to calm down and threatened Thomas that there were police next to him, so if Thomas dared to touch him, the police would shoot. In order not to reveal his disgusting appearance, Thomas had to let Jim go and intended to leave. At this time, Ephraim and Nora immediately followed. Even Abraham quickly moved towards them. They chased the trail to a dark tunnel, but lost sight of the target at a turn. At this time, Thomas found Abraham, who was lost. Abraham swung the silver sword in his hand, but Thomas easily dodged it. Now Thomas was completely unafraid of the old Abraham, because Thomas's body had been transformed by the vampire. Thomas pressed Abraham against the wall. The long tongue in Thomas Thomas's mouth began to wiggle. But just as Abraham was about to be sucked, a gunshot rang out, injuring Thomas. It turned out that the Ephraim group had arrived in time. Thomas immediately avoided it, but he still managed to threaten to come and take Abraham's life in a few days. Then Thomas chased the train, jumped up with all his might, and hung onto the train to escape. The total eclipse caused the vampire epidemic to completely break out. To prevent all this, Abraham led the Ephraim group to start searching for the vampire's lair. First, they broke into an empty supermarket to look for ultraviolet lamps. The light could make vampires lose their ability to fight. Here they met a rat catcher named Vasily. After the conversation, they learned that Vasily had also seen those vampires the day before. While running away, he accidentally discovered that they were afraid of sunlight, so he came here to find ultraviolet lamps. Vasily gave Ephraim a few lamps and then drove away. Ephraim's group went to the convenience store to buy supplies. At this moment, a vampire suddenly appeared and rushed straight into the glass door of the convenience store. Fortunately, Abraham swung his sword and beheaded it. The people in the convenience store all looked outside with terrified faces. Immediately after, another vampire slowly approached. Abraham also held his sword and walked towards it. When he reached the vampire, he pulled out his silver nail gun, and after only a few shots, the vampire knelt on the ground. Then Abraham raised his sword and beheaded it. Vasily also ran to join the fight, but his weapon was completely unable to destroy the vampire. As more and more vampires appeared, Ephraim's group was quickly surrounded. An old man tried to escape from the side, but a vampire suddenly appeared and sucked his blood until only a dry corpse remained. The others were holding silver guns, and Vasily held a rusty iron stick. Fortunately, he had good physical strength, so the vampires could not approach. Jim had just used the ultraviolet lamp to destroy the vampire in front of him when another one suddenly appeared next to him. Jim was caught off guard and was knocked to the ground by the long tongue. But luckily, Abraham appeared in time and used a sword to finish off the vampire. Seeing more and more vampires surrounding them, they had no choice but to hide in the convenience store. Ephraim looked at the dense vampires outside and knew that hiding here was not the way, so he immediately charged the ultraviolet lamp. He wanted to use the light to escape from here. At this time, Jim was treating his wound in the bathroom because the place attacked by the vampire could be infected with a virus at any time, so he had to use alcohol to disinfect the wound. Vasily asked Abraham about weapons because he didn't understand why he couldn't finish off those vampires. Abraham told him that apart from the light, only decapitation and silver weapons could defeat the monsters. In addition, the pistols they had just used were also loaded with specially made silver bullets. Ephraim then told them about the situation outside and told them not to go out at this time. But a girl completely didn't believe what Ephraim said and ran straight out despite his objections. However, the strange thing was that those vampires didn't attack her but let her escape intact. Everyone looked at this scene with puzzled expressions. Ephraim also seemed to understand that they were not looking for others, but their target was Ephraim's group. Abraham also confirmed it. The blonde girl thought that the zombies were targeting Ephraim's group, not her. Abraham told everyone that this was the vampire's purpose. He wanted to scare everyone into panic, then cause a division, and finally defeat them one by one. At this time, Ephraim did not know whether to believe Abraham or not. However, at this moment, a fat man and a blonde girl ran out of the convenience store. They also wanted to get out of here quickly, but not long after going out, the fat man was attacked and quickly became food for the vampire. The girl collapsed to the ground in fear, but fortunately, Ephraim and Nora ran out in time. With the help of the ultraviolet fairy light, they successfully brought the girl back to the convenience store. Now it seemed that Abraham's words might be true. All of this was deliberately arranged by the vampire. However, when everyone was confused about what to do, Nora discovered something unusual on Jim's face. Under the ultraviolet fairy light, she saw a filarial worm under his skin. In order to prevent the threadworm from controlling Jim's body, Ephraim immediately began to collect things that could be used to remove the filarial worm. After everything was ready, Ephraim used a knife to cut open Jim's skin. Without anesthesia, they directly pulled the threadworm out and used the ultraviolet fairy light to destroy it. Nora stitched up Jim's wound. Although the worms were taken out, no one was sure whether this method would actually work. At this moment, a scream suddenly rang out from outside. A monster used a cart to smash the glass door. Fortunately, Ephraim and Abraham arrived in time and dealt with it. Ephraim was a bit surprised to see the zombies using tools to attack people. Abraham felt something was wrong, so he quickly ran out of the store, and sure enough, a monster was quickly climbing towards the electrical box. Abraham immediately raised his gun to shoot to stop it, but as soon as he shot down the monster, the electrical box above also exploded. The convenience store was immediately plunged into darkness. Ephraim's group had no choice but to place an ultraviolet fairy light at the door to temporarily stop the monster's attack, but the back door was also smashed by the monsters. They began to attack the convenience store together, leaving everyone with no choice but to retreat to the main hall. Now, there were monsters everywhere outside. They knew they couldn't wait any longer, so they had to find a way out. The truck in front of the main gate was their only hope, but the key was on the fat man who had just been bitten. This meant they had to risk their lives by going through the monsters to get key. Vasily told everyone to use alcohol, towels, and Molotov cocktails for protection, as this could at least stop the monsters for a bit. However, just as everyone was busy, worms appeared on Jim's skin. Ephraim immediately ran to take off Jim's shirt and saw that his body was covered in worms. Everyone immediately became tense. Jim also realized that he was completely infected, but he didn't want to turn into that kind of monster. So Jim asked Ephraim to kill him, but Ephraim couldn't bear to do it. Ephraim believed that there must be a cure. Jim reluctantly asked Abraham about the state after the transformation. Abraham said that the transformed people would return and find the people they loved the most. The most cruel feature of this evil curse is the human emotional bond. Human love will turn into a desire that makes the infected person crave to suck the blood of the person they love. Jim heard that after the transformation, he would attack his friends, family, and the people he loved the most, so he became more determined in his thinking. But Ephraim still wanted to convince Jim not to give up. However, at this time, the monsters had already attacked the roof. Vasily pulled out a pistol and finished off Jim. Although Vasily did not have any authority to do so, this was the best way at this time, because if they continued to drag it out, everyone would die here. At this time, the monsters had burst through the door and rushed towards them. Everyone quickly ran out of the convenience store and surrounded them in a circle with ultraviolet lights. Vasily used Molotov cocktails to attack the monsters that came out. They just like that. While destroying the monsters, they advanced towards the truck. Ephraim also successfully found the car key. With the support of everyone, he also quickly opened the back door of the truck. Vasily used Molotov cocktails to cover everyone's retreat. When everyone got into the car, Vasily also immediately ran to the driver's seat. The monsters outside were blocked by the fire on the ground. Ephraim and the others successfully drove away. In the night, Matt stared at his wife who was sleeping soundly on the bed. He stood there struggling internally for a while, then turned and went into the bathroom next door. His wife lying on the bed was also awakened by the sound of the door closing. Because the two had just argued the day before, she thought that her husband was sulking and hid in the bathroom. So she took the initiative to apologize, but no one answered in the bathroom. The next day, Kelly still went to work at school, but when she got to class, she found that half of the students were absent. Her co-workers told Kelly that many people were sick today, which immediately reminded her of her ex-husband's warning that a terrible virus was spreading in the city. With current situation, the virus was likely to have spread. She quickly packed up her things and prepared to take her child out of the city. But when she rushed home, she found that her husband had transformed. Just as Kelly was still in shock, her husband suddenly swung his tentacles to attack her. She quickly ran out of the house while the monster was imprisoned in the strong sunlight. She sat in the car, rubbing her eyes constantly, trying to get the filarial worm that had just entered her eye. But the filarial worm had already merged into her body and quickly multiplied inside. It was dark soon, and Kelly also showed signs of change. She got out of the car in a panic. After seeing the blood-sucking monster on the street, her heart also had a thirst for blood. Then, she went to find her best friend. She silently looked at the photo of the two of them in her best friend's house. At this moment, her best friend's son came down from upstairs. As soon as Kelly saw the boy, she immediately lost her mind. The child's mother saw Kelly swinging the tentacles in her mouth and tightly wrapping around the child, so the mother rushed to stop Kelly but was thrown away. Not long after, the whole family of Kelly's best friend had their blood sucked dry. After eating and drinking her fill, she ran out onto the street. At this time, the passers-by in her eyes had all turned into delicious food. Suddenly, a voice rang out in her ear, calling her to come find it. Kelly went straight into the dark sewer, following the voice's instructions, and deep in the sewer, 2-meter-tall monsters suddenly appeared in front of her. The owner of the voice was none other than the vampire. It seemed that Kelly was the one it had chosen. The vampire who had lived for thousands of years had reappeared. In order to find his hiding place, Ephraim's group brought their equipment and went down to the basement. They discovered many human belongings in the tunnel through the sticky liquid splashed on the ground. It was obvious that the owner of these items had met with an accident. After that, everyone cautiously continued to move forward, and suddenly from the front came the growling of monsters. Vasily took the ultraviolet lamp and went forward to check and saw a group of monsters resting on the ground. Abraham told everyone that these were newly transformed monsters and that the transformation process would consume a lot of their energy. Vasily intended to take this opportunity to destroy the monsters, but was stopped by Abraham. Abraham explained that these monsters were all linked to the vampire's consciousness, so if they were to be killed now, the vampires would sense everything. So everyone turned off all the lights and gently walked through the monsters. Deep in the tunnel, they discovered a cave, and the cave entrance was covered with slime from the monsters' bodies. Ephraim thought that this might be the entrance to the monster's lair, so he took the ultraviolet lantern and crawled in. Not long after, Ephraim saw a large cave. After confirming that it was safe inside, Abraham also crawled into the tunnel. Suddenly, a group of monsters appeared behind them. Vasily saw this and immediately told Nora to quickly crawl through the tunnel. Abraham pretended to be weak and asked Ephraim to pull him a bit, but no matter how he called, he received no response. At this time, Ephraim's ex-wife's voice rang in his head. Kelly kept calling Ephraim's name. Abraham, who was trapped in the tunnel, was also waiting desperately. However, because in his head there was only the voice of his ex-wife who had surrendered to the monster, Ephraim could not hear Abraham's call. Abraham also realized that Ephraim was being controlled by the monster, so he tried to stop Ephraim, but it was completely useless because Ephraim had lost consciousness and followed the call in his head. In the cave, there was only Abraham's unanswered call. Nora heard Abraham scream and immediately realized that something might have happened inside. So Nora and Vasily used pistols to kill the monsters surrounding them and quickly entered the tunnel. But because Vasily's body was too big, he was stuck in the middle of the road. Worse still, behind him appeared a monster approaching him in a strange position. Luckily, Nora pulled him out in time and used an ultraviolet fairy light to repel the monster. But when the two looked around, they could not see Ephraim and Abraham anywhere. At this time, Ephraim had followed the call and went deep into the cave. Here, Ephraim saw the coffin had disappeared before. But as soon as Ephraim opened the coffin to check inside, his ex-wife's call rang out again. Ephraim hurriedly looked towards the source of the sound and saw only hundreds of monsters approaching him. Ephraim immediately lost his mind. Ephraim roared, challenging the vampire to come out and fight him. But as soon as Ephraim finished speaking, a 2-meter-tall figure jumped down from the wall. It was the vampire. Ephraim lost his mind and drew his knife to attack, but the vampire was too strong, so in a split second it knocked the weapon out of his hand. Then it lifted Ephraim up with one hand. It asked Ephraim if he came here to destroy it. The human vampire smelled Abraham's scent from Ephraim, so it also realized that Ephraim came here with Abraham to destroy it. However, it thought that they would definitely fail because it was now extremely powerful. It had taken everything from Abraham. It threatened that it would definitely take everything from Ephraim to punish him as a price to pay for wanting to eliminate it. The monster leisurely said that it was very thirsty for human blood and that it would finish Ephraim here. Just as Ephraim was about to be destroyed, Abraham appeared behind them with a sword, but the vampire only said one sentence and made Abraham so painful that he could not move. Luckily, Vasily and Nora arrived in time and threw ultraviolet bombs at the vampire. Immediately, the surrounding monsters were destroyed by the light. The vampire also took advantage of the chaos to escape. Abraham was extremely angry when he saw the vampire running away. He had been chasing vampires for so many years. Today, he finally met a real vampire, but he was chased away by Vasily's bomb. Abraham angrily smashed the coffin with a hammer. At this time, he was blinded by hatred. After that, he ignored everyone's objections and continued to search for traces of the vampire. Not long after, they saw an infuriating scene. Inside a dark cave filled with molten rock, countless vampires lived. Abraham angrily charged in to fight them to the death, but fortunately, Ephraim's group stopped him in time. After that, everyone returned to the shelter together. Based on the clues they knew, they deduced where the vampire might be hiding. Ephraim and Vasily prepared to explore during the day first, so the two of them went to a tavern together. Sure enough, they saw the smashed coffin in a secret room of the tavern. It seemed that the vampire and his gang were trying to repair the coffin, and there were monsters guarding it. To ensure safety, the two returned to the shelter to discuss a few things. Before leaving, Vasily lifted the manhole cover outside so that sunlight could shine on the pipe below. After the two returned to the shelter, they immediately gathered everyone. This time they would destroy the vampire, and Ephraim's son would also join the battle. When everyone was ready, Abraham told everyone about the traps that the vampire often used. He said that it would use everything against humans, so no matter what people saw or heard, they could not stop until they defeated the vampire. Then they went together to the secret room in the tavern. As soon as they arrived, they saw an army of monsters blocked by the sunlight. Abraham said that the sunlight would not stop them for long, but Vasily did not care. He took out a bundle of explosives from his backpack, lit it, and timed the explosion to throw it at the monster. After a loud explosion, the monsters in the tunnel were also blown to pieces. Then, everyone continued to move forward and quickly reached the place where the coffin was hidden. But at this time, the coffin was surrounded by 7 monsters. Abraham encouraged everyone and raised his sword towards the monster. Then the group took up their weapons and advanced. Abraham led the group to quickly deploy the battle. The silver knives and silver bullets in their hands had great damage to these monsters. Not long after, they destroyed a part of the monsters. Vasily told Abraham and Ephraim to go find his vampire son and the others to stay and clean up the remaining monsters. Suddenly, another large group of monsters rushed in and surrounded them. Thomas also stepped out from among them. Nora quickly opened fire, but her silver bullets could not cause much damage to Thomas. Vasily saw that and quickly swung his knife to attack, but he was easily knocked away by Thomas. While the fight between the two was getting intense, Abraham went upstairs alone. His wife's voice kept ringing in his head, and dark shadows kept passing by him. Suddenly, the vampire appeared behind Abraham. The two exchanged friendly greetings with each other because they had been waiting for each other for a long time. At this time, Ephraim also arrived. He immediately told his son to help him break the glass on the wall. The sunlight immediately caused the vampire to feel pain, but Abraham was still sent flying, and the silver sword in his hand fell to the ground. Ephraim saw that and quickly broke the glass on the ceiling and raised his knife to rush towards the vampire. But the vampire pierced the glass behind him, exposing his entire body to the sunlight. At the same time, the other monsters seemed to be summoned. They all escaped from the battle and retreated. The vampire's body on the roof was emitting white smoke from the sunlight. Abraham intended to take this opportunity to destroy the vampire. But when Abraham was about to cut off his head, the vampire tried to endure the burning sensation caused by the sunlight and stood up. His body also grew 2 meters taller. He tried to suppress the burning sensation from the sunlight and quickly escaped. Abraham couldn't believe what was happening before his eyes. He had been chasing vampires alone for so many years. He didn't expect vampires to be this strong now. If the sunlight couldn't kill him, what could finish him off? Humans were defeated. Today's story ends here. Thank you for watching. Goodbye, and see you in the next videos.